We continue to read the case of Fiona Alfred versus Mario Alfred. It's a divorce case and it falls under mainly the Property Rights of Spouses Act. Now, we've looked at the background to the case, we've looked at the evidence presented, the submissions by the attorneys at law. What we have here are the issues. I'll read through the issues. Then the next section will be law and analysis. This would be, I checked it, 23 pages of legal technical analysis of this case. What I will do is just go to the conclusion directly, and then for later on in other videos we go through the legal technical analysis of this case. Now, issues. I have considered the submissions and the authorities that were advanced and relied on by the parties. I have reduced those to the undermentioned main issues. I have also referred to several authorities that they both relied on. My failure to mention all of their authorities in my analysis does not indicate that I did not consider them essential, but rather that I found those highlighted of greater importance to my decision. That's the judge making the decision. I am grateful to both sides for their erudite submission. This word erudite, I paused a while ago and looked it up. New word to me. It means having or showing great knowledge or learning. Okay, that's what it means. I find that the relevant issues to be decided on are: 1. Whether the Property Rights of Spouses Act is applicable where the opposing spouse is claiming a right by virtue of adverse possession. So one spouse is claiming that they alone have rights to the property because they were on it for a long time and the other spouse abandoned it. 2. Whether the claimant, Mrs. Alfred, discontinued possession of the property, whether Mrs. Alfred has been dispossessed of the property, no longer in possession. 4. Whether the property is the family home. And 5. Whether the interest of the parties in the property should be adjusted, that being adjusted from the 50-50 rule, taking into consideration Section 14.2 of the Property Rights of Spouses Act. Alright, so these are the issues. We'll look at the issues in other videos, but let's look at the conclusions for now. So we've seen the evidence presented. We look at the conclusion, and then after that we look at the analysis of the issues. Conclusion. On the totality of the declarations being sought by the parties, I make the following orders. Right. Orders that the court is making. 1. That the property known as lands part of exchange, lot 907 Bogue Village, phase 3, PO Box 70720, Reading, Montego Bay, in the parish of St. James, which is the subject property, is not the family home. Well, I guess that's because the entire family wasn't living there for many years. Alright. 2. That the subject property is declared the matrimonial property of the claimant Fiona Kedisha Alfred and the defendant Mario Raphael Alfred. Okay. So even though it's not the family home, the home where the family live, it can still be matrimonial property. 3. That Mr. Alfred is not the sole owner of that property. 4. That Mrs. Alfred and Mr. Alfred are both entitled to 1/2 legal and beneficial interest in the subject property pursuant to Section 14 of the Property Rights of Spouses Act. 5. That the subject property be valued by a reputable valuator to be agreed by the parties within 28 days of this order. The cost of the said value to be borne equally by the parties. So both of them must pay equally to value the property. 6. If no valuator can be agreed within the stipulated period, then the valuator shall be appointed by the registrar of the Supreme Court. 7. That the defendant, that Mr. Alfred, be given the first option to purchase Mrs. Alfred's 50% interest in the property at the value outlined by the valuator, and must within 60 days after receipt of the report pay a 10% deposit towards the purchase of Mrs. Alfred's interest in the subject property. 8. The time for the completion of the agreement for sale is 120 days. That would be 4 months after the execution of the contract. 9. If Mr. Alfred fails to exercise his option to purchase the property, that's Mrs. Alfred 50% share, within the stipulated time, it is ordered that the said property be sold on the open market, and the net proceeds of sale are divided equally between the parties. 10. That the law offices of Damita Gale, attorney at law, is to have carriage of the sale in respect of the subject property. 11. All costs incurred in the transfer of the property are to be borne equally between Mrs. Alfred and Mr. Alfred. 12. In the event that either party fails or refuses to sign the agreement for sale and the instrument of transfer, the registrar of the Supreme Court is authorized to sign for the defaulting party. That means if one of them decides not to sign it, the registrar of the Supreme Court might sign it. Because you can see that Mr. Alfred lost his case because the court says that Mrs. Alfred has a 50% share in the property. But Mr. Alfred didn't want that to be the case. 13. Cost of the claimant, that's Mrs. Alfred, liberty to apply. The claimant's attorney, Mrs. Alfred's attorney at law, is to prepare, file, and serve the order. Alright, so those were the conclusions, that the property is the family home and it should be sold. Mr. Alfred has the option to purchase Mrs. Alfred 50% share in it and she gets the money. Or if not, it is sold on the open market and the money divided equally among both of them. Now, in our next video, we will start looking through the law and analysis that applied to this case.